Fellas, this is every MMA term summed up in one video. Casual. A casual fan is an MMA fan who kind of dips in and out the sport. For example, they might only watch pay-per-views, they might only pay attention to the main card rather than the prelims, but this kind of term has been twisted and it's essentially just anybody that disagrees. So you could say take a revolve in MMA, and if you disagree with somebody else, you're suddenly a casual. Fraud checked. A fraud check is a fighter who loses much earlier than expected, didn't really live up to potential. For example, Peyton Talbot was a minus 1,000 favorite going into the fight with Hany Barcelos and got dominated in that fight and obviously got fraud checked. Prospect. A prospect is a fighter with hyper potential, but they haven't really yet proved it in the UFC. Like Vinicius Oliveira, 4-0 in the UFC and has looked amazing so far, had some really good wins over unranked fighters, and has a record of 22-3, but he's still yet to face a single ranked opponent. Contender. A contender is a fighter close to the title picture. So for example, Shavkat Rakhmonov can't be a prospect because he's already proved that he's contender worthy after he's beaten 3 top contenders, and he's ranked number 2 in the division. Permanent contender. A permanent contender is a fighter who stays a top contender for a long period of time. For example, Dustin Poirier. He's been in the top 5 in 2018, he was in the top 5 in 2019, he was in the top 5 in 2020, 5 years later, and he's still in the top 5 of the lightweight division, and he's never won an undisputed belt. Veteran. A veteran is a fighter who's been around for the long period of time in the UFC, and he's close to retirement. For example, Jim Miller, 41 years old, debuted in the UFC in 2008, has had 46 fights in the organization, and his debut age was 24 years old. Gatekeeper. A gatekeeper is a fighter that never materialized into a contender, but they do have success stopping these young, hungry, and up-and-coming guys. For example, number 15 ranked Dan Ige is 0-6 against fighters ranked above him in the featherweight division, but always has a good chance of beating these young, hungry guys, so he kind of just serves the purpose of being a barrier to stopping from people getting to the rankings of the featherweight division. Journeyman. A journeyman's a fighter whose main purpose is to build the name of other fighters. For example, Makal built the name of Caio Bralo, built the name of Michel Pereira, beat the name of Kevin Holland, and built the name of Sharon Magomedov, and his only purpose is just to use and to build up other stars and kind of just give them free wins. Weight bully. A weight bully is a fighter who cuts way too much to gain a size advantage over other fighters. For example, Alex Pereira was 6'5" and walking around at 220 pounds while being in the middleweight division. He was huge for this division and was even bigger than some light heavyweights whilst competing at middleweight. Decision machine. A decision machine is a fighter who cannot finish a fight to save their life. For example, Merab, he's got 19 professional wins, 15 decisions, and has a 79% decision rate. Even though his game plan works and he's one of the more dominant champions in the UFC, his style doesn't really favour finishes and he can't really get a finish to save his life. Finishing machine. A fighter who tends to finish their fights more than anything. For example, Shavkat Rakhmonov, 19 wins, 1 decision, and has a 5% decision rate. Before the Ian Gary fight that he recently had, he's finished every single opponent in the octagon, and he's known to be the boogeyman of the welterweight division as one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC. One-dimensional. A one-dimensional fighter is a fighter who specializes in one aspect and sucks in everything else. For example, Ben Askren had 100% in wrestling and 0% in everything else. He was a really good wrestler, one of the best the UFC saw at the time, and he was a big wrestling prospect because of his grappling, but his stand-up, which is surprising for how long he's been in MMA, was awful, and he got exposed in the UFC and even in boxing when he went to go box Jake Paul. Can. A Can is a low-level, low-potential fighter. For example, Kiefer Crosby. He got submitted not once, but twice in the UFC. He's 0-2 in the organization. He's got a record of 10-5, and nobody really expects Kiefer Crosby to go far. Gas tank. A gas tank is just simply how much stamina a fighter has. For example, Merab is known for having some of the best gas tank in the UFC. He fights at the same pace in round 1 as he does in round 5, whereas Abbas Magomedov, he fights amazing for the first minute, looks title worthy, but in the second minute he's completely done, looking for a way out. Blank merchant. A merchant is a fighter who relies on a certain thing to succeed. For example, Josh Emmett is a power merchant, Umar Magomedov being a surname merchant, Sean Strickland being a jab merchant, and Benoit saying that he's been a bit of an aura merchant. Snooze fest. A snooze fest is a lackluster, boring fight. For example, Michel Pereira and Abbas Magomedov recently was a boring fight where nothing happened across 15 minutes. Adesanya and Yoel Romero is one of the worst title fights in UFC history. It was a staring contest for 25 minutes, but not as bad as Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza, where the only highlights come from this fight was simply from the commentary. Roidhead. A roidhead is a fighter who has suspicious qualities to make people think they're on steroids. For example, Paulo Costa has never failed a drug test. We don't know if it's the secret juice or some other supplement, but he looks very suspicious with how he looks and how his physique is. Michael Chandler, 0 failed drug test, but he's absolutely shredded to the bone. Looks like a bodybuilder in the lightweight division. And Kamaru Usman, 0 failed drug test. Again, has a bit of a suspicious physique and randomly developed KO power halfway through his title reign. Plot armor. Plot armor is a fight where a fight goes a certain way simply because of a deeper story. Like Dricus du Plessis looks terrible in all his fights, but he's on an undefeated run in the UFC and he's defended the belt. Whereas Yoel Romero looked amazing in every single one of his performances, but still managed to find a way to lose on a consistent basis, being the opposite and having bad plot armor. Pipsqueak, a midget. Undisciplined middleweight. An out-of-shape heavyweight who could probably make middleweight with a bit of a cut. For example, Chris Daukaus, Parker Porter, Harry Hunsucker, Roy Nelson, and Tanner Bowser. These are fighters who were just unnecessarily fat for the heavyweight division and could easily probably make not only light heavyweight, but middleweight, and they kind of just carry a bunch of unnecessary body fat, and to be honest, I can't blame them because it's a much easier division to compete in. Recency bias, where MMA fans cling on to recent events. For example, people trying to claim that Bilal Muhammad is arguably greater than GSP, or that Jose Aldo was never that good, and completely downplaying his resume because of recent events in the bantamweight division. And the opposite of that is the brother nostalgia bias, where MMA fans favour older events and fighters over recent ones. So for example, people might try and claim that Cody Garbrandt could make it competitive and even beat Merab, or that Frankie Edgar could beat Islam Makhachev. People forget, man, you weren't there in Frankie Edgar's prime. Stacked card. A stacked card is simply just a card that's stacked with big names and fun fights. For example, UFC 300, UFC 314, UFC 299, UFC 308, all amazing cards. Apex slop. An awful UFC card in the Apex to fulfill the ESPN deal, where a card is just completely awful, the main event is not intriguing and does nothing for the division at all, and the card is just these low-level, low-profile fights just to serve up something for the UFC. The fight cards end up being massively forgettable, nothing really interesting happens, it completely deadens the atmosphere because it's not in front of a crowd, and is genuinely the least favoured UFC events right now. Crotch sniffer. A fighter who shoots takedowns constantly throughout a fight. For example, Merab. His game plan is just to take you down consistently. He doesn't want to keep you down, he wants to let you back up and then go back to shooting takedowns, and he actually set the record for the most takedowns attempted in the fight with PTN 2 years ago. Backpacker. A fighter who kind of just clings onto the back of opponents, usually to stall. For example, Aljamain Sterling. Even though he has got good jiu-jitsu, his game plan a lot of the time does just be to stall, take the back of opponents and do absolutely nothing with it. Dana White privilege. A fighter is favoured and given more opportunities by Dana White in the UFC. For example, John Jones didn't have to fight Tom Aspinall, he got a free title defense against Stipe Miocic. Sean O'Malley, rather than having to go and fight a contender after losing to Merab, they just simply gave him an elite rematch. And Bo Nickel had one of the easiest runs to the top 15 you could have given him, whilst also having 4 pay-per-view main card fights. Even Michael Chandler had a terrible record in the UFC and managed to get a #1 contender fight with Charles Oliveira after going 2-3 in the organization. Robbery. A robbery is where the judges scored a fight significantly different to how the majority of MMA fans did. For example, Jones versus Dominic Reyes. The judges scored it Jones unanimous decision. Everyone else scored it Dominic Reyes unanimous decision. Cyril Gordon versus Volkov 2. The judges gave it to Cyril Gordon. Everyone gave it to Volkov. Rinat Faguinho versus Carlos Leal. The judges gave it Rinat Faguinho. Everyone gave it Carlos Leal. And there's been a lot of this in the UFC and just in combat sports in general, where we still kind of are confused to see how a fight went a certain way and what the judges were seeing on that one night and how they've managed to actually keep a job across their lifetime of judging fights. GFL fighter. It's just a way to insinuate that a UFC fighter is washed. For example, Tony Ferguson being a GFL fighter, or just any low-level fighter who's coming to the end of their career in the UFC that isn't really UFC worthy and should go and get signed to GFL, where all the 58-year-olds in retirement homes are coming out to go and scrap. Negative fight IQ. A fighter who consistently makes dumb decisions in the octagon. Michael Chandler came to your head, and it came to mine too. For example, against Dustin Poirier, when he wobbled against the cage and shoots a takedown. When he had Justin Gaethje wobbled and fights like an ape. Or Jalin Turner, who dropped Renato Moicano and rather than going for the finish, let him back up, resulting in him getting finished. Or in the fight with Bahat Mondes, where he's actually doing well and just launches himself into a triangle choke. Pillow fists. A fighter with little to no punching power. For example, Aljamain Sterling has only had 3 KO wins, most by TKO in his career, has never dropped anyone or never KO'd anyone. Even the arguably the greatest of all time in John Jones has only ever dropped someone when a body shot to Shogun Rua and also dropped Lyoto Machida, and that's the only time he's dropped someone with a punch. Also, notable names: Merab, 3 TKOs, Bilal Muhammad, 5 TKOs, or Michael Chiesa, who has never ever won a fight by KO or TKO. Chinning. A fighter who tends to be more vulnerable to get knocked out or rocked. For example, Marlon Moraes went on one of the biggest KO streaks in MMA, actually managed to get finished by Mr. Pillow Fist himself, Merab Dvalishvili. And that is some MMA terms summed up in one video. If I missed any terms, let me know. Thank you for watching.